What is the definition of a friend? How many of you have friends? And so how would you define a friend? How do you define friendship? And what does friendship look like? I realize that we're in this series that we're looking at the life of David, but really what we're trying to do is kind of develop a toolbox, if you will, of things that we need, these items, these tools that we need so that we can ultimately slay the giants in our life, right? How many of you have giants in your life? Come on, everybody needs to raise their hand, right? Because we all have these things in our life. All right, so if somebody didn't raise their hand, you have permission to elbow them right now. Because we all have these giants in our life. And what we're doing is we're trying to learn how to use these different tools that David used so that we can ultimately, kill these giants, right? And that's what we're going to do. And so we're going to look at today this concept of friendship. And I love this. Through the years, I've collected just these different quotes on friendship. I want to share with you Benjamin Franklin, right? This is what he says about friendship. He says, be slow in choosing a friend and slower in changing friends, right? So be slow in picking who your friends are going to be and then be really slow at changing those friendships. George Washington said, associate with men of good quality if you esteem your own reputation, for it is better to be alone than in bad company, right? The great theologian Winnie the Pooh said, don't walk behind me, I may not lead. Don't walk in front of me, I may not follow. Just walk beside me and be my friend. Aww, right? Another one from Winnie the Pooh because he's so good. Wow, things are falling over there. Like this, Winnie the Pooh, a friend is someone who helps you up when you're down. And if they can't, they lay down beside you and listen. Yes. C.S. Lewis said, friendship is unnecessary like philosophy and like art. It has no survival value. Rather, it is one of those things which give value to survival. If you're going to survive, you need to have it. Henry Ford said, my best friend is the one who brings out the best in me. And then we have Helen Keller who says, walking with a friend in the dark is better than walking alone in the light. And so these quotes, they all attempt to define for us what friendship really is. And I don't think they can do a very good job. But did you know that the Bible actually speaks about friendship? And the Bible talks about the importance of friendship, the purpose of friendship, and how friendship can affect our lives today. And so we're going to look at a person as we define what friendship really is. And in my opinion, this person that we're going to look at today is maybe one of the most underrated, underranked, and likely overlooked people in the Bible. His name is Jonathan. And Jonathan was David's best friend. And so let's catch up together, okay? Because Jonathan was King Saul's oldest son. He's the oldest son. And although our study is on David, we've already learned a lot about Saul, haven't we? Yeah. Who would you rather be like, David or Saul? Good. You've already come to a great conclusion, right? We want to be more like David and less like, wow, this is really good. And so Jonathan is the first in line to the throne that Saul has. And so someday he would be king. And everybody likes Jonathan. Jonathan is a personable guy. He's a friendly guy. He doesn't think too highly of himself. He's actually a great warrior. If you read 1 Samuel, you'd hear that Jonathan, he climbed this large rocks, right? These large rocks, this large tower of rocks. And literally he single-handedly with his bare hands killed 20 Philistines. And the rest of the Philistines went running because they could see what he could do. So he's this incredible warrior. He was highly regarded on the battlefield. He was among the active troops. He didn't stand in the back. He went to the front lines with them. He had every reason to be selfish, every reason to be entitled, every reason to think highly of himself. But he just wasn't that into himself. He was kind of a humble guy. He was almost too good to be true. He was royal. He was a great leader. He was a great warrior. He was loved by everybody. And most importantly, Jonathan loved God. And that's what we're going to see. He was faithful to God. He depended on God. He trusted in God to give him strength and courage and power and all these other things that he needed. Everything that defined the great qualities in Jonathan's life were rooted in his relationship with God. And so historically, Jonathan is maybe well known, best known for his friendship with David. And Jonathan and David, they meet for the very first time right after David kills Goliath. Last week, Pastor Craig talked about that. Didn't he do a great job? How many of you are here? So I'm sitting in the Seattle airport, literally watching online, and there's this one moment where Craig goes, "Roar!" right? And then a bunch of you got scared. The guy sitting next to me was like half asleep. I thought, that was actually kind of funny. Anyway. And so literally, think about this. Jonathan, he would have been in the tent when David approached Saul to fight Goliath. Jonathan would have been standing there. All right, so you have Saul, he's in this tent, David comes in, he's like, listen, it's not right, this is God's army, and you're letting Goliath scare you, and you're letting Goliath taunt you, and you are letting them say horrible things against the army of God. This can't be right, this can't be true, right? And so Jonathan's listening to David as he says, no, we've got to do something about this. And when David is talking to Saul about fighting Goliath, he probably sounded a lot like Jonathan, and we're going to see that because this is how Jonathan felt. He thought, this is not right. Why are we letting the Philistines defy the army of God? We are God's people. We are God's army. We have the strength. We have the courage. We have God on our side. And so this is exactly what David says as he comes into the tent to defend. And so Jonathan would have been there. When David walked out of the tent by himself onto the battlefield. Jonathan would have been there when David was walking out and the Israelite army is sitting there thinking, serious? This wimpy, slinky junior high kid is our only hope of having life? Right? And you're going to have all these different conversations, and then all of a sudden they would have been there. Jonathan would have been there when Goliath taunted David and made fun of David and ridiculed him and put him down and made fun of him. Jonathan would have been there. Jonathan would have heard the Philistine army laugh at David as he walked out to fight Goliath. Jonathan would have heard the taunts and the vulgarity spewing from Goliath's mouth. Jonathan would have heard how David reacted to all of this and would have watched how David reacted to all of this. And what did David do? He simply called upon the name of God. And Jonathan would have seen what happened as he watched Goliath literally collapse, not with a spear, not with a sword, not with some mighty bow, but with a rock. And Jonathan would have seen David walk over and take Goliath's sword and cut his head off, right? Jonathan would have been in the tent when David brought back in front of Saul holding Goliath's decapitated head. Who says the Bible's boring, right? That's how Jonathan meets David for the very first time. Literally, this is Jonathan's first experience. He's holding a decapitated head of a giant. And that's where we get to 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 1. Look at this. 1 Samuel 18, verse 1 says, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. I love this. This is strong language. It's kind of awkward language. It's really strong language. And so it made me ask, what in the world was it? What caused this immediate connection? What drew these two together so quickly? I mean, sure, Jonathan doesn't want to be David's enemy because look what he just did to a giant, right? Was it because Jonathan was so impressed that David was able to do the impossible? Well, I don't think so, because Jonathan was also able to do the impossible. So what was it that establishes this great friendship, maybe one of the greatest friendships in all of the Bible? C.S. Lewis says this. C.S. Lewis says, friendship is born at the moment when one man says to another, what? You too? I thought that no one but myself, fill in the blank. This is what happens to Jonathan. Jonathan meets David for the very first time, and his response is, what? You too? I thought I was the only one. So what was this? I believe that David and Jonathan have this common passion. Friendships are built on this common passion, but this particular common passion was based on bold faith and full dependence on God. I mean, Jonathan is not his father. And so here they are together. Jonathan's just watched David do what seemed to be absolutely impossible. He just watched him do this. And so Jonathan's thinking, what, you too? You depend on God, you rely on God, you have this bold faith also? And so Jonathan sees somebody else who is loyal. He sees somebody else who has faith in God, who's bold enough to ask God for things, to trust God. He sees somebody who's depending on the strength of God. This is what draws Jonathan and David together. And so common passions can be great starting points for great friendships, all right? They just can. But what's interesting is all of a sudden you ask these questions, right? You like that too? Or somebody says, well, you're weird like that also? Right? Oh, that makes you excited too? Or you like that team also? And all of a sudden these close friendships can build. And what happens is when you look at friendships, you should be able to find what the common passion is, because that's what they talk about. That's what they discuss. That's what they think about. That's what they go do together. All these kind of things. We have to ask, what do my friendships reveal about what I'm really passionate about? What do my friendships say about my passions? What dominates our conversations? What's the commonality when we gather together? What do our conversations reveal about us? Sometimes friendships are built on common passions like sports or hobbies, but you've had this happen, right? Some of you have owned a boat and you sold the boat and all of a sudden you realize you didn't have any friends anymore. Right? Or that sports team starts losing really bad and they bail and you're realizing, I'm here watching this game by myself. And so here's the deal. This is the idea of common passions and friendships. We can build friendships on common passions, but the reality is when those passions change, those friendships change. But what's happening with David and Jonathan is they're building this common passion built on a bold faith and on this full dependence and this reliance on God. And what's happening is it's being built around depth and transparency and honest and vulnerability and consistency. And so Jonathan, he loved God, and this was his deepest passion. This is what drew him to David. A love for God will bind together friendships that last longer than any common passion of the world. Literally, a loving friendship will last eternity. And that's what we're seeing established here. And so we're going to see how this friendship plays out. Flip over to 1 Samuel chapter 20, all right? Because this isn't long after David kills Goliath. And as soon as David kills Goliath, this is what Saul does. He's thinking, whoa, he's got God on his side. And so Saul, he takes David and he kind of makes him his own, right? He's like, you're now my servant. You're now going to work for me, because if David is so powerful and so mighty, he's going to help Saul's kingdom. He's going to help Saul out. But then at some point, Saul gets jealous. He starts to get really jealous and kind of gets mean, and then he wants to kill David. It's really interesting. If you were to read through 1 Samuel, there's many times that David's sitting at the table, the dinner table with King Saul, and King Saul just all of a sudden throws a spear, right? Just throws a spear trying to kill David. Misses almost every time, but continually. And I thought, man, sounds like my Thanksgiving dinners. How many of you have families like that? You know, somebody's throwing spears. Yeah. But literally, Saul, he gets jealous. He gets envious. He doesn't like David anymore, wants to kill David. And so Saul, he tries to throw these spears at David. He tries to send assassins to kill David. And we're going to pick up right here where David is literally running for his life. And we're going to see what friendship looks like. And so let me read a couple parts of this and I'll make a couple observations. Chapter 20, verse 1, then David fled, right? He's afraid, he's scared, he's running, he's trying to get out. And he gets before Jonathan, and this is the conversation. David asked Jonathan, what have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life? And Jonathan said to him, far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? It is not so. But David vowed again, saying, your father knows well that I have found favor in your eyes. And he thinks, do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. And then Jonathan said to David, whatever you say, I will do it for you. I love this because David is having a really bad day, isn't he? He's literally running for his life. He's been anointed king. He's killed Goliath. He's got popularity. He's doing the right things. God is on his side. But David is having a seriously bad day. Saul's lost his mind. He's trying to kill David. And what does Jonathan do? Jonathan does what a friend should do, right? Jonathan is this great example of a godly friendship because he knows that David is innocent. So he knows that Saul's the problem. He knows that David is innocent. And so what does Jonathan do? He reminds David, he says, listen, you are innocent. This is the principle. Jonathan understands that it pleases God to serve the innocent over the evil. And so Jonathan, because of this great love that he has for God, is able to separate the relationship with his father because he knows his father is in the wrong and still do what's right, even though it was for David, right? And so this is great because if the son of the king has a dad who's trying to kill you? If that son steps up into your corner to help you, to serve you, to protect you, isn't that a little comforting? Doesn't that feel good? And so in the conversation between two friends, Jonathan gives David a lot of comfort, reminds him that he's innocent, tells him he's innocent. And this is what a good friend does. A good friend makes good days better and bad days half as bad. How many of you have a friend like that? You're having a really great day and they show up and your day just got better. Right? Or you're having a really bad day and your friend shows up and your day just got half as bad. It's still a bad day, but it's not quite as bad as it could have been. This is what's going on with Jonathan and David. David's having a bad day, and Jonathan shows up and makes that day a little bit better. Look at verse 5 of chapter 20. David said to Jonathan, "Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit at the table with the king." I love this, because you still see the heart and the loyalty that David has toward God, and part of that is him placing himself at the table, which is where he should be with the king, even though this king is trying to kill him. So it goes on, he says, "But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field till the third day at evening. And if your father misses me," so let's put him to test, right? "Then say, David earnestly asked to leave of me, or asked me to leave, so that he could run to Bethlehem, his city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for the whole clan. And if he says, good, it will be well with your servant, but if he is angry, then know that harm is determined by him. Therefore deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant to the Lord with you. But if there is guilt in me, then kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father?" And Jonathan said, "Far be it from you. If I knew that it was determined by my father that harm should come to you, would I not tell you? Wouldn't I tell you about this?" And this is what we see. We see a friend comes to us when we are in messes. Literally. Even though David remained loyal to King Saul, Jonathan was committed. Jonathan was committed to helping David, even if it hurt him. And that's the question that we have to ask ourselves. Are we the kind of friends who jump in and help when our friends are in a mess? When they're struggling, when they're in the trenches, when they're in the pits, when they're in the darkest place? Do we show up and do we help them out? Verse 12, "And Jonathan said to David, the Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father, about this time tomorrow, or the third day, behold, if he is well disposed toward David, shall I not then send and disclose it to you?" So basically, if my father's going to kill you, do you think I'm going to tell you? Yes, I'm going to tell you. "But should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan, and more also if I do not disclose it to you and send you away that you may go in safety." There's a lot of words here. Basically, I'm going to tell you. If my father wants to kill you, I'm going to warn you. If he doesn't want to kill you, I'm going to tell you that too. "May the Lord be with you. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from the house forever. And when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies." Do you understand what just happened there? May the Lord deal with my father who is against my friend. Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. There's a lot of words in that part, right? There's a lot of bouncing around. There's a lot of conversation. But this is what I see. This is what I pull from it. These two friends, they possessed a deep wisdom. And together their wisdom was deep and it was thorough. And they had and maintained this positive attitude. And this is the reality. Great wisdom and positive attitudes is the best tool to fight with our enemies. See, what happens is typically we fight our enemies with the same tools that they're fighting against us with. How does that work? Usually. Not well. One person. Who said that? Two. Oh, two. Get you guys a cookie when we're done, okay? But seriously, how well does it work when we fight our enemy with the same things that they're trying to fight us with? It usually doesn't. And so what you have is you have this great friendship, and they possess this great wisdom, and they have this reliance and this common passion on God and this bold faith, and they have this positive attitude, and that's how they end up fighting their enemy. And notice Saul, by the way, notice Saul. Does Saul have any friends? No. Saul is friendless, and he has made his life all about himself, and he is miserable. Let me just tell you, if you're going to be friendless and make your life all about you, and by the way, making your life all about you will lead to being friendless, you will be miserable. When you make life about you, you are lonely and isolated, and you feel it. Would you rather be like David or Saul? See, Saul's using David as a pawn. He's using David as a pawn for his own benefit. And so Saul, he only cared about himself. He got jealous, and all of a sudden he's paranoid, and he viewed David as a threat instead of an asset. And Jonathan saw David and rejoiced over their faith. And so you can see the difference between the two all of a sudden. And what Jonathan keeps on doing is Jonathan keeps putting himself in second place. With David, every time he takes the second chair, willingly, he puts himself in second place. He's taking these deep sacrifices, these great sacrifices, these huge sacrifices so that David might be successful. And so what I want to do is jump back to chapter 18. Verse 1 again says, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit together with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. You remember that verse? We saw it play out in chapter 20, but look what else happens in chapter 18. Verse 2, and Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Verse 3, then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, and he gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. Man, this is who Jonathan is. Jonathan is in this position of power. He has authority. He initiates a promise with David. He didn't have to do it. He wasn't obligated to do it. Jonathan is the prince, and he could have done whatever he wanted to do, but out of his good nature, what he chose to do is sacrifice on behalf of David. And what did he sacrifice? Well, we read that he took off his robe, right? Well, it's just a robe. I was going to ask who wears a robe. Don't answer that question, okay? But literally, he takes off his robe and he hands David the robe. He says, listen, here is my robe. Take it and wear it. This is a deep sacrifice, a huge sacrifice, because the robe represented Jonathan's status. It represented his status. Remember, he's the first one in line for the throne of Israel. He should be king when Saul is dead. And yet Jonathan gives his status to David. It's almost as if Jonathan is saying, I'm not king, you are. Jonathan literally gave up his throne. He gave up his status to a future king. He said, here's my robe, take it and wear it. We also have armor, don't we? He took off his armor. Let's pretend this is not Roman armor, okay? We're pretending, make-believe, right? But he takes off his armor. What he does, he says, listen, here's my armor. Take it, wear it. It was his security. His armor represented his security, right? We read later in chapter 20 that Saul's throwing these spears again, throwing his spears, and Jonathan puts himself in the front line to protect his friend. He takes off the armor. He gives it to his friend. He gave up all of his security for his friend. How about this? We have the sword and we have the bow. What did the sword and bow represent? Well, the sword was also part of the protection, wasn't it? I mean, this is your weapon, but almost everybody in that time would have learned how to fight with a sword, but not everybody learned how to fight with a bow. So this was Jonathan's skill. This was his gift. This was his talent. This was his ability. This was something that made him unique. This is something that sort of set him apart. And so literally Jonathan hands him David his sword and hands him his bow, and he says, here it is. Now listen, Jonathan, he was a great warrior, but his specialty was the bow. And when Jonathan gave David his bow, he was literally giving up his skill, giving up his talent, giving up his ability for his friend. Literally, that's what's doing. Jonathan's saying, listen, I literally have your back, David. I'm going to give you everything I need. And so he gives him his bow. How about this? It's just a belt, right? How many of you wear a belt? Why? Because a belt gives us confidence, doesn't it? I'd be thoroughly distracted if I didn't wear a belt, and so would you. All right? But literally, Jonathan takes off his belt and gives his belt to David because it was his confidence. The belt held things together. You're running around with all of this stuff, right? You're carrying all of this stuff, but the belt, it held everything together and it gave a deep confidence. And so literally giving David all of these things, it was a true sign of vulnerability. It was literally giving up your protection and giving up your life in so many ways. And if you were someone, by the way, who handed your sword in this time frame, if I had a sword and I handed it to my friend, there was one clear expectation that you would take that sword and kill me with it. And so when Jonathan hands David his sword, this is a sign of vulnerability. Right there on the spot, he is vulnerable. Literally by giving David his sword, Jonathan saying, listen, my life is in your hands. I trust you. I'm giving you my life. But look what happens, verse 5. And David went out and he was successful. Did you get that? If you read chapter 18, 19, and 20 over and over and over again, the writer Samuel tells us that David was successful, that he was influential, that he did right in the eyes of God, that he did right in the eyes of Saul, that he was successful in everything that he did. And what I find remarkable is that David becomes the successful guy who literally everything he touches is good. Jonathan, though, he gave up his status and his security, his skill, his confidence, and literally his life for his friend. Jonathan gives up his future kingdom, his wealth, his livelihood, even his physical life. And Jonathan knows what is at risk here. He knows what's at risk, but he knows that it'll be absolutely worth it because Jonathan understands that he will thrive when David succeeds. Hear that? That's why friends take second place. Because in the second place, I will thrive when my friend succeeds. And so Jonathan understood this principle, such an important principle of friendship, that if Jonathan's going to thrive, if he's going to survive, if he's going to make it in this world, then he has to take second chair so that David could be successful. Jonathan loved David and was able to give it up for him based on that common love for God, that common obedience, that common dependence, that common faith that existed between the two of them. Here's what I know. We should want to be around people who clearly and obviously love Jesus first. Jonathan loved who first? He loved God first. We should want to be around people who love God. And when we surround ourselves around people who love Jesus first, we will learn how to love others best. And this is so true. You want to learn how to love the people who are unlovely in your life? And we all have them, don't we? You have the unlovables. Do you think of them right now? Yep, you might be sitting next to one because we even have unlovables at Mountainview, right? Seriously. I tell people one of the hardest parts of my job is trying to love the people who don't want me to love them. It's a challenge, right? Who make it hard to love. I'm like, can't you just try to make it a little bit easier? Like, you'd be such a great person if you just let us love you. But this is what's going on. If I really want to love these people who make it difficult to love, then I need to surround myself around people who love Jesus first. Then I'll find the power. So listen, just 4 or 5 or 6, I don't know, my numbers are messed up. Observations as far as godly characteristics for friends. I have 1, 2, 3, 4. This is really good. So, first one is this. We're not going to cover these, but there should be some verses written down on your notes. You can read these verses and see what I'm talking about or make sense of what I'm talking. Good luck to you. Okay? But number 1 is this. A godly friend sacrifices. Is a person who seriously, sacrificially sacrifices, generously sacrifices. And we saw that, didn't we? Jonathan gave it all up, didn't he? He sacrificed greatly. And another characteristic of a godly friend is that they come to the defense of their friend. They defend. And that's what Jonathan did. He runs out to see David when he's on the run and says, listen, you are innocent and you are not bound by the guilt that you think you're bound by. He defended him, right? But even before he could defend him, he joined him. Godly friends join. Winnie the Pooh, remember the great theologian? If I can't help you up, then I'll lay down next to you and I'll listen to you. You see, Jonathan didn't call for David. He didn't say, why don't you come to me? He didn't call for him. He could have. He is the prince. He could have done that. Instead, what does Jonathan do? He goes where David is at. Man, this is a characteristic of a godly friend. We join our friends where they're at, in the space they're at, in the trench or on the mountaintop. We join them where they're at. How about this? Correcting. Now, we don't really like that, right? I just want you to be my friend. I don't want you to tell me what I should or shouldn't do. Ever said that? They're not godly friends. If you're not allowing them to correct you, they're not godly friends. If you're not correcting them, they are not godly friends. Godly friends correct. And this is exactly what Jonathan did. He said, your thinking's not very good, David. You're thinking you're guilty of something. I'm telling you, you're innocent. Now, what if Jonathan let David keep running away thinking he was guilty? What would have happened? I love what Proverbs chapter 26, 4 and 5 say. All right, let me just read it here. I wasn't going to. These are important verses because this happens. Sometimes I have people in my life who don't want to correct me. You ever had those people? You're like talking about something and you're kind of questioning whether or not it's actually accurate or not. And they just kind of go, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Have you ever had that happen? Right? Wives, did you ever go talk to your husband about something, but they're really afraid to say, man, that's stinking thinking. You shouldn't be thinking that. And so they just kind of shake their head and go, mm-hmm. And you walk away thinking, yeah, I'm right. I knew it. Right? See, I said that because women, you don't have any problems telling us when we're wrong, do you? Ouch. Anyway, that was bad. Why'd you guys let me do this? Stop me. I got to look this side because I'm getting looked at by my wife over there. Here's this, right? Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself, right? Let me read that again. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. See, this correction piece, if we don't answer a fool according to their folly, we're going to be just like them, which means we're also going to be foolish. But get this, verse 5, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. See, if you don't correct me, I'm going to walk away thinking, I'm right. I'm right. And we do this sometimes. And a good friend doesn't do that. A good friend says, don't go there. Don't think that. Don't do that. They correct us. Finally, a good friend encourages us. A good friend is encouraging. That's what they are. That's who they are. You know what this all reminds me of? John chapter 15. Remember I told you we're going to be looking at David, but David is as much about Jesus as anything else. And because John is fresh, I immediately went to John 15. Listen to these verses. Jesus, he's getting ready to die. He's gathering his disciples together, and he's having this conversation with them. He says this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. And Jesus says, you are my friends. You are my friends. If you do what I command you, no longer do I call you servants, no longer do I call you slave, no longer do I call you disciple or apostle. I call you my friends, right? No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. And I love this verse. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed that you should go, and you should bear much fruit, and that your fruit should abide, and that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. This is what Jesus said, and we're going to see it in the life of Jonathan, right? Jesus said, I'm going to die for my friends. Will you just take a second and let me say that one more time. Let it sink in. Jesus told his disciples, those who were following him, he said, I no longer call you servants, I call you friend. Let's imagine that Jesus is here right now, and this is what he's saying. I no longer call you whatever, I call you my friend. The King of glory, Jesus, the Son of God, God himself in the flesh. He says, I'm going to die for my friends. The very last relational description that Jesus uses for those who follow him, those who are his disciples, he calls them friends, right? And sometimes we view God as this distant God who's standing behind us, waiting, eagerly waiting for us to screw up so he can nail us, right? Sometimes we view God as this distant, isolated, unattainable God who's sitting back, and what God's doing is He's just got a book and He's keeping records of all the bad things that we do, and He's just writing them all down. And this is how sometimes we view God. But Jesus, He shows up and He says, no, that's not who we are. I don't look at you that way. God doesn't look at you that way. We call you our friend. You are our friend. So why did Jesus have to go to the cross? He didn't. He chose to, so that we didn't have to. See, grace isn't out of obligation. It flows out of sacrificial generosity. Just like Jonathan, Jesus, according to Philippians 2, gave up his position, gave up his status. Jesus took off a robe and He put on filthy rags that we call humanness. And He walked among us. He gave up His throne and He gave up the keys to the throne room. He took off His robe and He gave up His status so that we could be His friend. And Jesus, you know what He did? He gave up His security. I mean, you're sitting at the right hand of God. Is there a much safer place in the entire universe? No. And Jesus, He gave up His security so that He could come to earth where He wasn't very secure, was He? Because they nailed Him to a tree. They crucified Him to the cross. They killed Him for being King of the Jews. And Jesus, He gave up His confidence. When He put on human skin, He gave up His confidence. He gave up His skill. And He came to earth and He lived among us and He put on human flesh, right? He suffered and He died so that we could have the keys to the throne room. And just like Jonathan, Jesus died for His friends because, man, we understand that real friends thrive when their other friends succeed. And Jesus understood that. Jesus understood that the kingdom of God, it could thrive and it could become great, and each and every one of us could become great. He would become great as long as we were successful, and the only way for us to succeed was for Him to die. Without Jesus, hear this, we cannot succeed. You might have some temporary success, but in the big picture, it's temporary. Jesus thrives when we receive grace. Who do you think thrives when we succeed through His grace and power? Jesus does. Jesus had no needs Himself. He put Himself aside so that we could have a chance to become His friend. Jesus sacrificed, He defends, He joins, He corrects, and He encourages. I don't know who you think Jesus is. But I'm telling you that Jesus wants to have a relationship with you, and He wants to simply say to you, you and I are friends. And in our life, Jesus will always take second place so that we can succeed. Every single time. It's what He does. It's who He is. It's His nature. He is the best friend any of us could ever have. God, thanks for today. Thank You for Jonathan. Thank You for David. But most of all, God, thank You that Jonathan was such a great friend to David. And that Jonathan was such a great picture of who Jesus is. God, what I pray today is that we would have a healthy perspective of who Your Son Jesus really is in our lives. That He died so that we could be His friend. He calls us friends. And every time Jesus as our friend will take second seat, He'll give it up. He'll sacrifice greatly. He did sacrifice greatly so that we might have peace and freedom, success. So God, today would You help us embrace Jesus for who He is. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.